Welcome to the Evolving Performance Podcast. The goal of this podcast is to share practical insights to maximize sport performance, durability, training adaptation, and career longevity. I'm your host, Kevin Neal. Today I'm excited to welcome Dr. Pat Davidson to the podcast. Pat is an independent trainer, prolific writer and speaker, and consultant in the New York City area. Previously, Pat served as the Director of Training Methodology and Continuing Education for Peak Performance and a Professor of Exercise Science for Springfield College. Pat is really unique in his ability to combine an in-depth understanding of biological responses to training stress with several decades of both training and coaching experience to create training systems and methods that are both practical and highly effective. In this episode, we do a deep dive on muscle hypertrophy, or putting on muscle, including the required stimulus for hypertrophy, in other words, what is required for your body to put on muscle, key training considerations to maximize muscular development, how the long-standing assumption that a specific hormonal response to training is required for building muscle may be misguided, special considerations for athletes that want to put on muscle, what quote-unquote hard gainers, people that really struggle to put on muscle, can do to maximize their progress, and key nutrition and supplementation strategies to maximize hypertrophy. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank our first sponsor on the show, Metabolic Elite. Metabolic Elite is a supplement and performance education company founded by James Laval, who is an internationally recognized clinical pharmacist and board-certified clinical nutritionist. Their entire line is designed to specifically support the health, performance, and recovery of high performers. Each product is formulated using research-supported ingredients and dosages using the highest quality ingredients, so you can be confident that every product you take will deliver the maximal benefit and effect. I've personally been taking Metabolic Elite supplements for the last several months, and one of the cool things about the line is that many of the products are made using a liposomal tablet delivery system, which is essentially just a chewable tablet. This LPT technology significantly improves the bioavailability of the supplement, or how much of the product is actually available for your body to use, but the chewable tablets are also easier to take for people that don't like swallowing pills. On a personal note, the two Synapsin products have been an absolute game changer for me. With a work and travel schedule that frequently requires both late nights and early mornings, I've never taken anything that's made me feel as mentally sharp as Synapsin. There's a lot of great information about Synapsin and the other products, the LPT technology, and other important tips to help you optimize your performance on the website. So go check out metabolicelite.co, that's metabolicelite.co, and you can save 15% off all products using the code NEALD15. That's NEELD 15 to save 15%. Now please welcome to the show, Pat Davidson. Hey Pat, thanks for doing this. Really excited to have you on.
Well, I'm thrilled to be on. We go quite a ways back, and I've always had nothing but the highest level of respect for you, and I think this will be a very interesting conversation, so I'm thrilled.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. I appreciate that. Let's jump right into it. I think, my goal for today was to really do a deep dive on hypertrophy with you. I think this is a topic that is really important for athletes to understand. In most sports, especially team sports, the players get bigger and stronger as you ascend the levels. So, understanding how to put on muscle and the best ways to do that, I think is really important, but it also has implications for non-athletes that are, interested in improving their health or their body composition, physique, whatever the case is. So, before we get into talking about methods to help put on muscle, can you talk about what actually causes hypertrophy? So, in other words, what are the mechanisms that signal the body to grow?
Yeah, and this is an interesting topic, I would say, because when you get into, we know a lot about protein synthesis, because the answer to the question is, what are the mechanisms that drive hypertrophy? It's protein synthesis. Protein synthesis has to outweigh protein degradation. If that happens, then you have an accrual of proteins. And, when we're talking about skeletal muscle, it's contractile proteins and structural proteins. We'll get into some of that, but we know so much about protein synthesis because it's directly in line with Watson and Crick and the discovery of DNA and the central dogma theory of biology, which is environmental signal going to DNA, which then codes for RNA, which makes proteins. Okay. So it's always signal to DNA to RNA to protein. And that was Nobel Prize winning science, and one of the most important discoveries we've ever had in the scientific community, and probably the most important discovery in biology. So, we understand the pieces of protein synthesis because it is going to be an activation of a specific part of the DNA. And then we make a copy of that segment of the DNA, which is called RNA. And then that RNA travels outside of the nucleus and goes to the ribosome. And at the ribosome, we assemble a protein. With this, we have the copying of the protein at the level of the DNA to make RNA, and then we have the RNA going to the ribosome, and the information in the ribosome is utilized to build a protein at the ribosome. So we have these two steps. We have transcription, which is the process of copying the DNA's code onto RNA, and then we have translation, which is the process of the RNA's information being utilized as a blueprint to basically build the protein. So that is mechanistically kind of like what's going on. And we know in biology with these things, you're always looking for what's the rate limiting step in a process. And the rate limiting step is in translation, it's not in transcription. Inside of translation again is the process of taking the blueprint of the RNA and actually constructing the protein at the ribosome with that. And we do that by going around the cell and gathering amino acids and then putting the amino acids together in a triplicate formation and stringing these triplicates along until you've built the protein. So the rate limiting factor is in translation, and we know that inside translation, because translation is like a million steps, it seems to be that the rate limiting factor is this step called mTOR, which is the mammalian target of rapamycin. And we believe that so you are always trying to keep mTOR active, and you don't want mTOR to become inhibited. And it seems as though the thing that keeps mTOR active is when there's a specific concentration of leucine, which is an amino acid, present inside the ribosomal region of the cell. So when leucine falls below threshold levels, then it seems as though mTOR shuts off. And when mTOR shuts off, the entirety of protein synthesis seems to stop, and we no longer synthesize proteins. So, like, that's like a pretty easy answer. Unfortunately, it's not very helpful in a lot of ways because, people are like, well, what do I do? Just like keep blasting leucine? And that doesn't really seem to work. You can't just infuse leucine and just have the machinery go. What it speaks to is that there is this process. Like, as long as the process rolls, yes, the you will be continuing to synthesize proteins, but it seems as though there's a lot of stops that can take place, and potentially also some areas that you can look at is like, as long as you're checking these boxes, you're probably going to facilitate this process fairly nicely. So what it comes down to really is like, you see that there's like certain levers that you can pull that allow protein synthesis to work at a pretty high level, and these would ultimately be the signals that you're sending to initiate the process. So we kind of have, resistance training, or, creating muscular tension as an area of signal. We have nutritional status as an area of need and signal, and as well as like just requirement to be there, like assembly materials. And then we have areas such as like lifestyle, sleep, stress management, things like that. You know, it's when you get into the mechanisms, people try to take advantage of it and sell gimmicky products and crap like that. But unfortunately, like, where the mechanisms seem to lead us in terms of like things like human randomized controlled trials and studies on what kinds of training methods actually work, it seems as though it leads us sort of like to a lot of these things of like the basics are really, really critical. So what you really need as a foundation in your life to be able to drive this stuff is you need to have a sufficient level of protein, which is a gram per pound of protein, gram per pound body weight of intake. So a 200-pound person would need about 200 grams of protein. More than that doesn't seem to be beneficial. And you need to be in a total calorie surplus. So if you are in a maintenance level or in a deficit, you're probably unable to drive any appreciable muscle gain. No matter how hard you're training, no matter what else is kind of going on, unless something like steroids would be in the mix. Thinking along the lines of like a normal natural athlete, you really need to be able to put yourself in a calorie surplus, or every other piece of the puzzle is going to be meaningless. Now, on top of that, there needs to be some level of resistance training. And we're probably going to talk about some of the specifics about the mechanics involved with what seems to be ideal. But what we can kind of say is that people have lifted weights for a long time, and there seems to be a pretty wide spread of methods to be able to use for resistance training input as to what would grow tissue. So if you are lifting enough weights, some form of resistance training, you're in a surplus, and sleep seems to be this really critical ingredient as well. It's insufficient levels of sleep will sabotage you in ways that we really can't even mechanistically explain altogether at this point. But at the end of all of this stuff of protein synthesis discussion and signals and Watson and Crick and blah, 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 it's kind of like you need to train, you need to eat, and you need to sleep. And if you're doing those things, then you're going to provide the general environment for being able to grow skeletal tissue.
No, that's great. And that's a good segue into let's dive into a little bit more of the resistance training strategies that people might use. Because I think when I was first introduced to strength training, I was 13 years old. I was lifting with my older brother at the local gym. You're doing body part splits, and at the
Mm-hmm.
time that was kind of all we knew. We're pulling from old school magazines and whatever we can get our hands on, and I feel like so much has evolved and changed over the last 20 plus years since I was going through that. Still, that's what a lot of high school age kids first exposure to strength training looks like. It really, wherever that messaging is coming from, it seems like that is still the approach that is the entry point for a lot of people into strength training. The reality is, because the window of adaptation is so large for people that are untrained, and particularly, and maybe we can touch on some of this too, but the hormonal environment of of particularly high school age males at that time, it's going to work for them. So I think that there's this thought process of like, well, I did this and then it really helped me a lot, without an appreciation for, was that the best strategy for that goal, and will it continue to work forever or moving forward? So,
Yeah.
let's kind of talk, I think with hypertrophy, as two extremes, you kind of have, you see some of these world class cyclists that have just huge legs. And then on the other side, you have power lifters that obviously have developed a lot of muscle mass. And, if we remove the pharmaceutical interventions
Mm-hmm.
from the conversation, you're left with two somewhat extreme opposite approaches. And not that the outcome is the same, but both of them have developed some muscle mass. So can you touch a little
Yeah.
bit on, maybe what are some of the common threads that are leading to hypertrophy, despite, what is happening in the body that's leading to hypertrophy, maybe in those two extremes, and then, talk a little bit about what some of the big rocks are from a strength training standpoint that
Yeah.
can lead to hypertrophy.
I'd say that it's really hard to remove steroids and performance enhancing drugs from the conversation because, you know, as long as those things have been around, and they've been around for a long time, like people will get their hands on them. And, I don't think that food or resistance training is as powerful of a signal and a stimulus for growth as performance enhancing drugs. Like that is a better tool than everything else for being able to drive muscle. And I think that you bring up a really good point of seeing like kids in puberty, teenagers being able to drive really good growth. because they're in a chemical environment that is promoting growth. So it's not dissimilar from performance enhancing drugs. It's an environment that promotes growth. um, you can see people, it's almost like alchemy with performance enhancing drugs. Like someone could be in a really terrible diet and use really kind of like crap training and still have amazing growth takes place, where it's like that shouldn't happen. Like what are you building this tissue from? You're literally able to eat your own fat and use that as energy to drive the machinery of protein synthesis to grow tissue. And it's kind of like, wow, that really kind of obfuscates the conversation. That's what it does ultimately. Is it's kind of like it's hard to evaluate from a scientific controlled perspective or discussion, like, hey, what works, because we have this enormous variable that's probably more powerful than any others, that more people are probably using than we know about. And it just makes it hard. But we do have a pretty decent amount of scientific evidence at this point, and there's some good backing. And so there are some, I think there's some decent recommendations that you can go with for like what's a good idea from a resistance training standpoint to really drive muscle. And so, I think you have to start from like the most basic place of, do you have an exercise that actually targets and works a muscle? You know, and I love the bringing up cycling, like the velodrome cyclists that do have like monstrous quads, and very obviously pedaling one of those bikes is clearly a quadricep specific exercise, and you can see that reflected in the development of the quads. If long story short, you're not going to grow big biceps by squatting. It's just not specific enough. Like, we're really operating inside of the principles of training, which is going to be specificity and overload, individual differences, and reversibility. Like, kind of everything ultimately comes back to those four pillars. And the more that we're able to dive inside of specificity and overload in particular, we get a sense of like what really works. So, on the specificity pillar, the exercise needs to be specific to the muscle. And it seems as though we have to drive fatigue into the muscle, and we have to make the muscle create tension and work in order to be able to respond in the aftermath. That's like as dumb as it gets, but also still like important, because there are people out there that like subscribe to this like drink a gallon of milk and squat every day concept for overall body growth. And it's like, well, that doesn't make a ton of sense. If you want to if you want to build your shoulders and your chest, that's probably not the best way to do it. You probably need to do some exercises that would follow the anatomical pathways of that particular muscle from insertion to origin, and the joint actions that it creates. So that's number one. Now, the second thing that I think is really the most important thing in terms of the hierarchy of variables is the exercise supported? I think that people make the mistake of like operating in open space in very unstable environments with their exercise selection. And that's not a great setup to be able to drive enough force into a muscle tissue. So, I operate with this concept that I refer to as ground, that I look at as like the most unifying concept of exercise science as I see it. So, I define ground as interacting with external support and interacting with things that provide neurological feedback. And I actually organize athletes according to a ground spectrum. So I kind of look at like low ground athletes that interact with very little ground on one end of the spectrum, which I would say like good examples are divers and half pipe skateboarders. And on the other end of the spectrum, athletes that are high ground would be like power lifters and interior linemen in football. So when I look at what makes someone a great low ground athlete, I think that it's the ability to turn and tumble in space at high velocities. And when I look at what makes someone a great high ground athlete, It's the ability to prevent yourself from being turned and tumbled by external forces. And there's certain adaptations that make you better at being a great high ground athlete. And I think that's generally building more mass and more skeletal muscle tissue. And I think that there's certain adaptations that make you better at low ground athletics. And I think that that is having really great joint positioning and being able to have incredible motor control and ultimately increase your mechanics for what would make you be able a good turner and tumbler, which is a deeper conversation than what we want to get into here. So I think that you can also categorize exercise along this continuum as well. So, when I think about high ground exercises, if I'm talking about a squat pattern, for instance, an exercise that would have more external support and more feedback would be something like a hack squat or a pendulum squat. It's got a back pad, it's got hand holders, it's got handles that you would hold on to, it's got a foot plate, it's on a track, so it only moves along that line. It really is going to, what I think about from this perspective is the more ground that is inserted into an exercise, the higher the probability that the person is going to recruit and fatigue the target tissue for the motor pattern for that particular motor pattern. So if someone, like a very high ground squat is, like I said, a hack or a pendulum. A high ground squat would be something like a barbell squat. A moderate ground squat would be something like a split squat. A low ground squat would be something like, a split squat in the frontal plane. And then a very low ground squat would be some kind of a lateral stance frontal plane split squat. That's sort of the way that I categorize things. And the basically when I'm looking at the athlete, I put them on the ground spectrum for where I believe they reside. And then I ultimately try to match them with similar ground exercises as the majority of their training volume. And then they would receive some level of volume outside that exact slot for the remainder of their volume. But when I look at someone and I say, hey, I want to put as much tissue on you as possible, I generally go with very high and high ground choices. And I just stay in that wheelhouse and I don't really bother with the exercises in moderate to low ground. Basically, it's like you need to be able to anchor yourself with external support so that you can create more leverage with your joints to be able to drive things with more force. When you really get down to the concepts around utilizing resistance training to grow tissue, there's potentially a few signals that could be being sent to the DNA to initiate the protein synthesis concepts. Historically, we've talked about, tension and metabolites and other waste products and things like that. But it seems as though the only thing that's really remaining at this point is tension. It seems like metabolites don't really matter. pH doesn't matter too much. Heat doesn't matter that much. It's just purely tension. So when I'm trying to think of ways to establish exercises that can drive as much tension into a muscle as possible, the first thing that comes to my mind is it needs to be strongly externally supported so that I can really go in and hammer that particular muscle with a lot of force. After I've looked at that, which I look at it as like that is the most critical variable. And when I see people, like I go to the gym all the time and I just see people like kind of flopping around with unsupported exercises. I'm like, I don't know what you're working with this exercise. You could be working a million things. Exercise to me is almost like trying to putt a golf ball, which is it's hard. It's hard to do. But if you're, moving around the whole time as you're trying to putt, you're really decreasing the chances it's going to go in the direction you want it to. You want to be very still, anchor yourself so that we know what the only moving thing is like, shoulders, arm, club. I don't want, knees and hips and back moving all over the place. I'm going to increase my probability of hitting the target with fewer moving pieces. So Now, like once I've established that as kind of the foundation for the design of the exercise, now I can look at a couple of other variables, which would be like the velocity and the length of the tissue. You know, what I look at like from a velocity spectrum is if you're able to move fast, it's you have not done what you need to do to be able to drive growth. Like you might start a set fast, but the set needs to end very slow in order to provide the appropriate stimulus for growth. We have this concept of relative intensity within resistance training, and it speaks to the idea of like how many reps did you have left at the end of the set. And this reps in reserve relative intensity thing seems to be a very important characteristic of exercises that drive growth. So if you are farther away than like 2 or 3 reps in reserve, the exercise is basically going to do nothing from the perspective of driving growth. You have to get very close to the point where you wouldn't be able to perform another rep. You have to get very close to failure. And the main indicator of approaching failure is the velocity of the exercise. So the exercise ultimately has to become very slow as a characteristic to drive growth. The last area that I look at is the length of the muscle tissue. Okay? Well, actually, 2 areas. I have to look at the length of the muscle tissue, and then I have to look at the resistance profile, which is found through examination of the resistance moment arm. So it seems as though there's been a really interesting emerging body of research over the last 3-4 years about lengthened partials versus shortened partials versus full range of motion exercise. Some of the early studies took a look at like a leg extension or maybe like a tricep extension, all of these like single joint exercises. And they just had the participants, equate volume and do a full range of motion rep or a lengthened partial. So only the part that's in the big stretch position and stopping midway, or shortened partial. So like midway to the top of the motion. And what they found was that the lengthened partial seemed to grow just as much tissue as the full range of motion rep. And that the shortened partial was significantly less growth compared to either full range or lengthened partial. So then they started to say, well, is it only the lengthened part of the movement that actually seems to be growing the tissue? And, they've done further studies to take a look at like, what if we kind of modify a leg extension and we really have them lay way back so that we put them into more hip extension? Does that grow the rectus femoris better than if they're sitting upright as they normally would in the seat? And it does. It seems to create a more prolific growth response by putting the muscle into greater length during the exercise performance. So it was kind of like, wow, length. Everything should have length. And then, there's been a couple clever studies that have played around with the resistance profile. One in particular that took a look at an incline bench dumbbell curl versus a preacher curl with a dumbbell. So if you're doing an incline bench dumbbell curl and you're laying back onto the incline bench, your arms are hanging down by your side. At the bottom of that exercise is the most lengthened part for the bicep. And in that place, the dumbbell is basically directly under the elbow joint. And so when you're talking about moment arms, the resistance moment arm is the horizontal distance between the working joint and where the load is. So if the dumbbell is directly under the elbow, there's basically no resistance moment arm. There's no horizontal distance. As you lift the dumbbell up, you're moving the dumbbell horizontally further away from the elbow. You're increasing the resistance moment arm as the exercise shortens. With an exercise like that, you're biasing the mid-range, and because as you go into the short position, it's coming back towards the elbow, so you're decreasing the moment arm. So, the torque is the only real thing that matters, okay? And torque is the combination of load and the horizontal distance away from the rotating joint. So an incline dumbbell curl would favor more of a mid to short position of a biceps versus a preacher curl. As you're lowering it, the dumbbell horizontally continues to move further and further away from the elbow. So it's biasing, there's more and more torque as it gets longer and longer and longer. This study showed that the preacher curl significantly outperformed the incline curl from a biceps growth perspective. And it's sort of leading towards this idea that if you really want to create a great growth exercise, you want to feature this combination of reaching a point of muscular length and combining it with a large resistance moment arm. So you can really start to look at exercises and say, well, a dumbbell lateral raise doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense from this lens because the stretched part for the shoulder is the bottom and the dumbbell is directly underneath the shoulder. And the hardest part is the top where the muscle is very short. Now, if you encounter something like that, there's solutions. You can always use a cable and change the angle of the cable so that it's, going to bias the lengthened part for the deltoid. You start to look at compound exercises and you realize why they're so effective because in a squat, for instance, as you're lowering the weight now stays over midfoot, but the knees and hips are horizontally moving away from the location of the load. So the horizontal distance between the working joints and the load is increasing due to the movement of the joints. And you get a sense of why deeper squats tend to work better for promoting growth because the lower you go, the more that the joints move away from midline. So the more torque you're putting on those tissues and joints. And, long story long, like the tension variable is probably the most critical piece. And so tension increases as you move joints away from as the horizontal distance between the joint and the load increases, torque increases. And the muscle has to create more tension to match or overcome the resistance torque demands that are being placed on it. Length is an avenue into tension, is what I think is emerging from all of the analysis on this. So if I can anchor parts of the body appropriately and give the person support and feedback, and then drive length and torque into the exercise, I probably have the best case scenario from an exercise selection standpoint, as long as the person is putting enough effort into every set to where the velocity drops off significantly by the end and they're really getting close to failure.
So I'm glad you kind of ended on that note because I wanted to go back to that reps in reserve and the relative intensity idea. And, one of the things that I think comes up in talking about hypertrophy is kind of like an optimal set and rep range. Was it better
Mm-hmm.
to stick with, sets of 1 to 5 reps and accumulate more volume by adding more sets, or is it better to stick with more moderate loads and accumulate fatigue through higher rep sets? So when you talk about that 2 to 3 reps in reserve as kind of a demarcation line where if you're not crossing that, it's probably not a potent stimulus for growth. If you're doing a set of 4 or a set of 20, that 2 to 3 reps in reserve represents a significantly different percentage of the total volume of the set. So,
Yeah.
I think you kind of alluded to this with velocity loss and fatigue, but can you touch on, what maybe is the most important factor in determining with those two strategies what's actually going to lead to growth? And, maybe also, Pat, like, why would somebody be better off pursuing one of those strategies over the other?
Yeah. I think that this is one of those logistics kinds of answers. So what's interesting is we've got meta-analysis level research at this point that shows that you can experience equal hypertrophy from loads going anywhere from 85% of the 1 rep max down to the 30 rep set. Like as long as it's, your 30 RM up to 85% of your one rep max, which is somewhere around, I think, like five, you can get equal growth from those. That's a huge swath of real estate that you get to operate in from an intensity perspective. Selection process. Again, you just have to get close to failure. So if you're doing your 30 rep max weight, well, you got to do at least like 28, 29, or 30 of those things. And sometimes that makes sense, and other times that makes no sense from a selection process. So the times where it would make no sense would be like if you were selecting a squat, for instance. That is horrific. And there's a lot of other factors that would probably interfere with you being able to approximate failure. Like, the mental challenge of battling through that many reps of an exercise like that, the cardiovascular challenge of it, the metabolic stress of it. There's a lot of other things that could stop the set prior to muscle failure, fatigue sorts of stuff. So with a set of squats, for instance, you're probably much better off operating in that sort of 6 to 15 range. And that depends on a lot of things. It depends on, how a person's feeling. It depends on different people just liking different things. As a for instance with me, if I'm in a major calorie surplus and I've been putting on a lot of weight, it just feels kind of nice to have something heavy. Versus if I'm in a deficit and I'm like deep into it and extremely fatigued and like getting lightheaded, I'm not picking the heavy one. That's like the worst feeling in the world. I'm going to pass out. I'd much rather go for like 12 to 15 under those circumstances. There's, then there's like an exercise like a cable lateral raise. And it's like, I don't want to do 6 of those. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel right for those small muscles. Something in the range of like 15 to 20 to 25, that could be perfectly fine for an exercise like that. So, generally I would say the more compound it is, the more total tissue involved with the exercise, the heavier the exercise, the more you're probably going to see it be like towards the heavier end of the spectrum. And then the smaller the exercise, the lighter the exercise, the smaller the muscle group, probably going to be just fine towards the lighter end of that spectrum. You just want to avoid conflict. The thing that should end the set should be local muscle factors. Like the muscle is done. You want to avoid other confounding factors influencing the end of the set.
So in the discussion about tension and length, one of the things that comes to mind is just the different emphasis on contraction types. So
Mm-hmm.
more eccentric lengthening under load traditionally involves more damage, which there may be a thought process that more damage provides an opportunity for more growth. What are your thoughts on the impact that contraction type has? I kind of along with that is when you're talking about tension and time and torque and fatigue, this idea of using isometric contractions and sustained holds, and is that a strategy that could generate hypertrophy?
Yeah, so really good topics here. I think that we know that damage is not a good proxy to use for what's going to drive growth. Damage is not, it doesn't seem to actually be related to growth. And we do know that excess damage is counterproductive for growth. Like when you're after exercise, you have to repair tissues and then you have to build tissues. So if you actually spend less energy on repair, better. That's much better because now you have more energy and more resources to direct towards growth. So, just getting sore is not, it's kind of an old adage at this point. It's not a good reference point to look at and say, oh, that was a really good job that we did there for driving growth into that tissue. Now, conversely, if there's no soreness, that's also probably not good either, because it probably means that you didn't drive enough stress into the tissue. So there should be, as you're training and you're going through the weeks upon weeks of accumulating volume and and load, it should be kind of a similar level of soreness as in the aftermath of training tissue. And I think that the lengthened exercises with high torque can definitely create more damage. It's just more stressful overall. So you could look at it from a number of different ways. You could say, well, in the beginning, maybe I don't need to use these lengthened position, high torque exercises because the person is so sensitive to growth. I can get away with other exercises that are actually shorter positions and less total torque put on it, and experience some growth. And I can save these lengthened exercises with high torque for as the person has adapted more and become more difficult to drive growth into. It's just like saving an ace card or something like that. I don't know what the answer is on this, by the way. These are all very, it's like we're just finding out the concepts. We don't know how to play the cards yet. It's like we're beginning to see the whole deck, and people are already speculating on the best strategies for playing the game. So it's possible that that's a good way, or it could just be, well, always use the lengthened high torque exercises and just really dose them much easier in the beginning and be more careful about initial volume for what you use. I think either one is fine. I tend to go with the second method because I want to spend my time teaching the person how to execute the activities that we're going to do long term. And I think from a long term perspective, the higher tension, higher torque, lengthened exercises, I think are the appropriate tool for the job for growth promotion. And I want you to learn how to do those with the highest level of proficiency possible. And generally speaking, like, I'm not a big exercise variation person. I want a few good choices that stay in that program for a long time. And that gives me a better lens on whether or not you're experiencing progressive overload. I can see, what's going on with your fitness levels more clearly, as opposed to if it's a new thing all the time. I don't know if you're getting better as a result of neural adaptations or if this is really a fitness improvement that's driving this quantitative increase. That's sort of the approach that I would take thought process wise with that. And then as it comes to like prolonged isometrics, there's actually quite a bit of research in the last few years on the hypertrophy that results from prolonged stretching, static stretching. And so we've seen like, I'm glad I haven't been a subject in these things. They'll put people into like calf stretches for like 20, 30 minutes and, with some kind of a device, and it'll be at like, I think 85% of tolerance. Like, it's a really nasty stretch. And they'll see very large amounts of overall calf hypertrophy after weeks of training with this method. It seems as though you can utilize, and that, because that is an isometric, it really is. I look at stretching as just another form of resistance training. Basically, that's all it really is to me, conceptually. So, if you put someone into some kind of a high tension position and they hold it, you should be driving those responses. I think it's just psychologically more difficult and like timing more difficult, logistically more difficult to utilize that approach if the only goal is growth. But I think that isometrics for prolonged periods have additional benefits as well, seemingly with tendon health and chemical changes inside the tendon. So if you want to sort of kill multiple birds with a stone, I think that that's an avenue you could look into.
Yeah, it's pretty common for us in the early phases of the off season to emphasize some of those longer duration holds for a lot of the reasons you just mentioned. And it's a stress that does check a lot of boxes and I think is important, but it is one that the athletes are not sad that we move away from
Yeah,
as
nobody likes that.
progresses on. It can be pretty boring and monotonous to get through some of those. We've talked a lot about different strategies that that will lead to a local tissue response. And earlier you had mentioned the chemical environment globally on, whether we're talking about puberty or, more pharmaceutical interventions. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, the impact that a local, chemical environment or a global chemical environment can have on hypertrophy, and really the not just the impact, but is there a requirement for that? And I remember, at different stages I've come across things where, there's recommendations of doing something that's going to lead to a massive hormonal response, and then, doing other exercises, because once those hormones are circulating through your blood, that maybe you can get to drive them into more of a local tissue environment, and that could be a strategy to lead to hypertrophy. So I'm interested
Yeah.
on, local metabolism versus global chemical environment, and what impact, if any, those two things have on hypertrophy.
hmm Well, we have reached a stage where we can confidently say scientifically that the hormone hypothesis has been debunked. And I know guys that spent 40 years in a career looking at hormones and resistance training that leads to hormonal responses. It's some of our best scientists in exercise science. They spent their whole careers looking at that, and it's kind of crazy now to look back and say, wow, that was an area that just didn't pan out, and for a long time that was considered to be the most important area of what you wanted to try to drive to be able to promote growth. All the recommendations were like, well, 3 sets of 10 with 60 seconds rest on compound exercises, because that's going to lead to the biggest growth hormone and testosterone responses. And when you create that, that's what's going to lead to the morphological changes. And I don't know who was the scientist that came along and basically was like, actually, if I plot it out on a big, curve of like, hormones on the y axis and time on the x axis, we can see that exercise that drives hormonal changes, it leads to such a small amount of time under the curve where the hormones are elevated that they don't cause any, and they don't result in any drive of anything. Basically what emerged from this analysis was that all we're witnessing is a stress response. Like Sapolsky would be thrilled with hearing this in some ways, but it's like when you stress someone with heat and acid and load and cardiovascular challenge, it's like all hands on deck, because this is such a horrible thing that you're making me do, that yeah, my endocrine system comes online as well to try to release as many chemicals to get me through this awful experience as possible. But interestingly enough, it has no correspondence to actual growth results from a long-term perspective or even a short-term perspective. This is very different from what you would see with puberty or from performance enhancing drug use, because that is a period, or those are environments where you have elevated androgens and anabolics for a long period of time. It's the time under the curve of the chemical environment that matters so much. And that's why those two areas are so powerful for establishing a growth promoting environment. Now, the one thing that seems to obfuscate this is blood flow restricted training, where it's like that seems to result in, pretty substantial growth. And, the old explanation for it was that you are trapping all of these waste products in the local environment. And then when you release the tourniquet, this basically poisonous soup just is released into the bloodstream, and the chemoreceptors in the arch of the aorta read this and recognize that it's like this very threatening concoction, and they signal to the brain to be able to start the hypothalamic pituitary cascade of being able to promote this enormous bolus of growth hormone release, because you do see like this 300% rise in growth hormone from BFR. And but that's like irrelevant at this point, because it's like yeah, sure, you get this big rush in growth hormone, but it's like, not enough time for it to be as significant. And so I don't think anybody's quite sure at this point why BFR in particular does seem to promote this response. I think that it's speculated that you are essentially starving the working cells of oxygen, and that means that your slow twitch fibers, which would normally be used, excuse me, to lift light loads, are unable to really participate, and you're forcing your faster twitch fibers to participate in higher rep situations, which they're very poorly equipped for. And as a result, they fatigue tremendously in those circumstances. And whenever a fiber is recruited and fatigued, it will be subject to adaptation. That's, I think, probably the explanation that holds the most water.
Well, it's really well said. I want to transition a little bit. I think anytime you're working with people that have this goal of putting on weight, you're gonna hear at some point somebody's gonna say, I've tried everything and I just can't put on weight. And there's this idea of the quote unquote hard gainers that it doesn't come as easy for them. So I'm curious, in your experience, what are some of the things that when somebody comes to you and they say, I've tried everything and I can't put on weight, what are some of the things that they're typically missing? Or what are some of the strategies that you might use if maybe on the other side of the spectrum, if you feel like what they've tried is appropriate and they're still really struggling, what would some of the strategies be that you would help to send a stronger signal to their body to help get them over the hump?
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at what they're doing training wise. Sure. That's like, and again, like I usually see when I go to the gym and I see people basically using low ground exercise selection and stopping well short of failure and never reaching stretched positions. So like they don't check the right mechanical boxes when left to their own devices oftentimes. And that makes sense to me because it hurts. The stuff that works kind of hurts. More supported equals heavier, and heavier plus stretch is threatening. And why would I do that to myself as a biological organism unless I know that there's some like really crazy abstract goal that's in the future? I'm willing to suffer for this thing in the future. But if I don't understand the premise, I would never do that. So you have to educate and coach people on how to do the right exercises, but it's probably less important compared to the actual nutritional status. And, the only way that you know that you're in a calorie surplus is if you're gaining weight. The only way that you know that you're in a calorie deficit is if you're losing weight. And if you're staying the same weight, you are at maintenance. And, all of these things have a window. Maintenance, it's not like this person's maintenance diet is 2,200 calories. And if they eat 2,250 calories, they begin gaining weight. Like if you eat over this imaginary, like let's say the person believes that their maintenance calories is 2,200 and they eat 2,300 calories, the body will change some operating strategies and it will increase things like non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or it will put more resources into reproductive pathways, or it will do something to utilize this energy. And you will stay at maintenance despite having increased 100 calories. There's some threshold and window that you have to go above and beyond because maintenance operates in a window. So let's say that window is between 2,000 calories and 2,500 calories. You really have to get above and beyond 2,500 calories a day to begin the process of gaining weight. People oftentimes report that, like, but you don't understand, I eat so much. And it's like, if we actually break it down, what they usually do is they have a couple of big meals a day. And that's not the best way to go about eating a substantial amount of calories. I think pretty much every competitive bodybuilder in the world at minimum is 5 meals a day, because like if you eat really a huge meal, you stuff yourself. And it's hard to come back and eat again pretty soon after that. If you eat like a pretty big meal and then a couple hours later you eat a pretty big meal and then a couple hours later you really, in order to get enough food in, I think that's the only way to actually do it. The other thing is like, we live in this sort of like obesity focused culture and sport and science community. And we sort of have recommendations on how to avoid obesity as the primary dietary information that people are getting. And it seems as though the hyper palatability hypothesis is probably the most correct one. Like the tastier your food, the more likely you are to eat more of it. And so if you decrease palatability, and palatability comes in a lot of forms, like from the perspective of like, combinations of macronutrients, combinations of, salt and seasoning, and also like the combinations of mouth feel are all important variables that lead to palatability being better. Like as a for instance, pizza is very palatable because it has a really good ratio of carbohydrates and fats together with substantial amounts of sodium. And also the mouth feel differs between bites. Like you kind of get like crispy crust and gooey cheese. And then if something has every bite feels the same, your brain is less interested in it. Pizza also switches a little bit between like a sweeter part and a more savory part. So it's got all of the things that would drive you to want to eat more of it. So I look at it like if somebody's a really hard gainer, well, I try to take a look at the foods that they're eating and I try to find ways to make the food more palatable. And then I try to increase the number of feedings per day for that person. And I think that those two approaches are more likely. If somebody doesn't want to eat, they're probably not going to eat. It's like as simple as that. So I have to make them want to eat. And so I have to try to keep them hungry and I have to give them foods that taste really good. And it's basically the opposite approach of what you would go with for preventing obesity.
No, I think that's been pretty consistent with my experience too. You talk to some of these high school kids that, like we talked about earlier, are in the perfect stage of their own development to put on significant amounts of weight. And, when you bring up the nutrition question, typically they'll say, like, oh, I eat so much all day long. And really what that equates to is, they have like a waffle or something small and insignificant for breakfast. They have a couple snacks for lunch, and then they come home and gorge on whatever their parents make for dinner. And the reality is that in that 24-hour cycle, they're really having like one meal with any actual nutritional substance to it. And, I think just the idea of regularly scheduling inputs and meals so that
Yeah.
you're not overeating in one, so that you're also allowing yourself to accumulate more over the course of a 24-hour time period is really important. Pat, what about from a supplementation standpoint? Is there anything that you've seen that really makes a significant impact on building muscle?
I have personally like dabbled with performance enhancing drugs. And I think that's valuable for me from a seeing what actually works and getting a sense of like once you've experienced that, like you kind of recognize like God, these things aren't driving it. You know what I mean? Like so there's like the supplements that are worth your money are like protein supplements, creatine, if for aerobic performance, caffeine, maybe fish oil to a certain degree, but like everything else is pretty much garbage. Like fat burners in particular are like the most garbage thing in the world. But it is kind of like after having experienced what PEDs do, it's kind of like, oh my God, like this is what is selling all of these supplements. You know what I mean? You just see people that have been using PEDs for substantial amounts of time and have accrued unbelievable amounts of tissue as a result of that. And now they're, just trying to sell you this bullshit that doesn't really do anything. And I think for me, just having a firsthand experience with that has been, at the very least, maybe not as eye opening as it would be for some people, but like it just drives the point home. Like, you know, we are victims mostly of marketing and, sales driven through corporations that are trying to make as much money as they possibly can, and largely through products that are not that helpful. Like, compared to quality training, sleep, and getting a calorie surplus in, it like the supplements that people get excited about are literally nothing.
No, I think that's a great point that, and I think that's been one of the themes that I'm taking away from this whole discussion is that, there's a lot of noise in the training space in general, but particularly with hypertrophy and body composition changes. And, what I've heard from you over the last hour or so is that really like a lot of the foundational big rocks executed consistently over time are where you're going to get the most bang for your buck if you're looking to put on muscle mass. And, I think in a lot of the populations, certainly where I am now, where the schedule dictates some challenges in terms of sleep and lifestyle. But, even thinking back to my time working in the private sector where you're dealing with a lot of high school and college kids, I feel like sleep is one of those things that is easy to overlook and frequently gets pushed to the side that can have the largest impact, certainly obviously relevant to hypertrophy in this discussion, but on other markers of cognitive performance, on motor learning, on
Mhm.
just more global markers of both learning and performance that, I think that it's good to hear you say that within the context of this message too, because I think that's an important one for people to hear and
Yeah.
probably put a little bit more effort into.
If people would focus on sleep the way that they do on meaningless supplements, like, they would get. I mean, look, if everyone was getting 8+ hours of sleep, that would probably be the biggest impact change on their body composition that they could get. And it's free. You just have to go to bed.
Well, Pat, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time today. Where can people learn more about you? And I know you have some courses. Let people know what you have out there.
Yeah, all my stuff kind of runs through Instagram at this point. Like, I've got a website, but the main hub is just my Instagram page, which is at Dr. Pat Davidson, Dr. Period Pat Davidson. And yeah, I have a number of things that I offer. I have built an app actually that's able to see whether or not you're getting close enough to failure for your sets. Like, it actually uses your phone, and you can video yourself like people do in the gym, and it displays the velocity of your reps. And when they've gotten slow enough, then they start to show green in the velocity bar graph that's being given to you as feedback. And so you actually know that, like, the exercise that you did would be able to promote muscular growth, so long as all the other things that we talked about are in there. But uh, I've got that. I've got seminars that I teach on resistance training, on speed and agility, on changing table tests. I try to. That's probably my main career area of focus is around that. It's all the seminar series is called Rethinking the Big Patterns, and its centerpiece is what I was talking about with ground, and then seeing the way that ground is able to be manipulated in all of these different ways that ultimately provide the coach a guide on exactly where to start with people and exactly the trajectories to take with different populations, from an exercise selection and exercise design perspective. That's those are some of the areas that I focus on career wise.
Cool. Yeah, we'll be sure to link to your Instagram account and then to your website and the different courses in the show notes. Thank you again. I really appreciate you taking out the time to talk to us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.